Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Treasury just logged the biggest September surplus in history at $198 billion on the month, fortified by $30 billion in tariff revenue. Keep this up and we'll pay off that national debt with enough left to buy Greenland. The numbers come from the monthly Treasury statement, which reported $540 billion in tax revenue for last month, up 3.2% from a year ago, but just $350 billion in spending, down a whopping 25% from last year, with Joe Biden auto-signing the checks. It was the fourth biggest surplus in history, and it improved the 12-month deficit to a still miserable $1.8 trillion deficit. Now, for perspective, 1.8 is the entire federal budget 20 years ago, back when phones had cords. So what drove the surplus, and will it ever happen again? On the revenue side, Trump's tariffs hit $30 billion on the month, $360 annualized. For perspective, that's about 10 times what the death tax collects. It's almost as much as the corporate income tax collects. And it will probably keep going up, so tariff revenue is rising at about 8% per month. Meanwhile, income taxes, the big kahuna, held steady at 2.5% growth, suggesting we are not, in fact, in recession as much as Bloomberg is praying for it. But the concern was that stellar $180 billion drop in spending. Probably 35 is calendar effects because September started on a Saturday, which affects debt interest and tax payments. Another 124 was real, but it's a one-time revaluation of student loan debt where Big Beautiful Bill cut taxpayer exposure. So the surplus is real, but it's not going to keep going at 198. Still, when a pig flies, you do not ask how high, even if it is fortified on one-time cuts and the gossamer wings of month starting on Saturday. So as next, while we may not see it on our $198 billion surplus for a while, we're in a much better position than under Biden, whose last budget wanted a 10% increase in spending. Trump has held it to half that, of which 96% is either mandatory Social Security, mandatory Medicare and Medicaid, or debt interest from the $37 trillion debt Trump inherited. Actual discretionary spending, the drunk sailor stuff, like USAID, EPA, migrant welfare, and wars, rose just $16 billion on the year, which is 0.25%. Of course, stopping the bleeding is one thing. With a $1.8 trillion deficit, we need to actually reduce spending. Trump's using the shutdown to try and gut some of the $2 trillion in non-essential federal spending that Democrats have welded onto the federal government as their personal slush fund. And if he can break the Dems on the shutdown, he could open a path to Republicans cutting spending. I know pigs fly. For now, the best you can say is things are not getting worse as fast as they were under Biden or Cackles, but we are nowhere near out of the woods. Republicans are trying to redistrict as many as 20 House seats. This could swing the midterm elections, winning a GOP House and breaking the 100-year tradition of the party in power losing the midterms. That would give Donald Trump a clear runway the rest of his presidency. In the past several months, Texas and Missouri drew new congressional maps to break up districts that had been intentionally drawn to give Democrats an advantage, so-called gerrymanders. Florida and North Carolina are now following suit, with another 4 red states waiting in the wings: Ohio, Utah, Indiana, and Kansas. Together, these could swing as many as 20 seats, which could swing the midterms. In fact, it could permanently remove Democrats' 50-year gerrymander advantage in Congress. So the background here is that of the states Trump won last year, Democrats got 69 congressional seats, almost 1 in 4. But in the states Kamala won, Republicans got just 1 in 7 seats, 39. That 30-seat swing almost cost Republicans the House, with the GOP currently holding a majority of just 6 seats out of 428. In other words, swing enough rhinos to fit in an SUV and you can pretty much block anything. More important, in the past 50 years, gerrymanders meant Democrats won the House 3/5 of the time, compared to 50-50 in the Senate, which cannot be gerrymandered. Concretely, those stolen terms include the term that created the EPA, the one that impeached Nixon for doing what all presidents used to do. It includes Reagan's first 2 years when Dems watered down his tax cuts, includes the passage of Obamacare, Trump's final 2 years when they hounded him with subpoenas and multiple impeachments, and Biden's first 2 years that gave us the highest inflation in a generation. Together, these transformed the republic with 30 seats. So how did we get here? Since the 1970s, Democrats shamelessly drew districts to disenfranchise Republican voters. You can see the result. Massachusetts congressional districts look like an oil slick that gives 0 seats to the 1/3 of Massachusetts voters who vote Republican. As J.D. Vance recently posted, across New England's 21 congressional districts, Trump won 40% of the vote last year and got precisely 0 seats, 0 out of 21. California, New York, Illinois, they all play the game. So what's next? Democrats are trying to use lawsuits to block redistricting by the elected representatives in red states. What could be more democratic? They're using a cynical reading of the Voting Rights Act as mandating racist districts because nothing fights racism like requiring it. The Supreme Court is set to reconsider that reading, and odds are they will decide for Republicans, meaning no more racial set-asides for blue districts. But even if they don't, enough balls are rolling at this point that Republicans could trim Democrats' gerrymander down to 20 or even 10 seats. That matters for the midterms and Democrats' ability to stonewall Trump's final 2 years in an ocean of subpoenas. More important is a fundamental shift knocking out yet another cheat that Democrats and rhinos have used for 50 years to ruin the nation. A word from our sponsor. If you own gold, and many of you do, you already understand how it protects your wealth from the insanity coming out of Washington. The inflation, the recessions, the wars. But with monetary metals, there's a way to actually earn a yield of up to 4% on your gold paid in more ounces of gold. You retain ownership of real, allocated physical gold with no storage costs while your ounces grow every month outside the banking system. If you're serious about protecting your future and building your legacy, head to monetarymetals.com/Peter to get started. Now back to our show. The government shutdown could end this week, according to Trump's top economic advisor, Kevin Hassett, just when it was getting fun. Meaning hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats could soon be paid to abuse us. In an interview with CNBC, Hassett said he thinks Democrats are trying to find an artful way to surrender now that the No Kings Karens are back with the cats, while actual voters blame Dems for the shutdown, which probably surprised them after 80 years of mainstream media echo chamber. Now, Hassett is still a minority view, and he could just be messaging. Prediction market Kalshi is still predicting a glorious 40-day shutdown. Still, if Dems are ready to surrender, how does this end? So logically, Dems begging for mercy means Republicans should squeeze every last drop of juice. This could be pairing a reopening with extra spending cuts to Dems flush funds like green energy or welfare for the able-bodied. Even better would be structural changes that permanently reduce the size and power of government. This could be making it easier to fire federal workers, make them permanently at will, on the logic they serve at the pleasure of voters, represented by the president voters elected. It could also be making it easier for Trump to cut useless spending, so-called impoundment when the president does it, or a simple majority rescission when Congress does it. They could even bundle a reopen with the Holy Grail Reins Act, which requires all major regulation actually be passed by Congress. Today, 90% of regulations, the bureaucrats just made them up. Make Reins retroactive, and it could slash regulation, inflation, and end the regulatory jihad that wipes out family farms and chased manufacturing to China in the first place. Sadly, our spineless Republicans probably won't get anything in a surrender. In fact, Senate Leader John Thune has already caved on Obamacare subsidies, one of the Democrats' key demands. These are COVID-era subsidies that average $62 per month and together add up to $350 billion in taxpayer money that overwhelmingly goes to HMOs and hospitals. Caving, of course, will not stop Democrats from doing this again. In fact, it tells them all they gotta do is find the right $350 billion and keep it up. Now, Republicans surrendering from the high ground should sound familiar because it is a 50-year tradition. In the 1981 shutdown, Republicans abandoned Reagan's welfare cuts. In 1990, they agreed to raise taxes, which cost read my lips George Bush the election. In 1995, they abandoned Gingrich's spending cuts. 2013 abandoned Obamacare reform. 2018 got a floor vote on DACA, which would legalize millions of illegals with not one penny for the wall. If congressional Republicans fought in Iraq, we would all be speaking Arabic. So as next, the smart money is Republicans always chicken out, racco. In fact, I'm surprised they've held up this long. Democrats are begging to surrender, but don't expect Republicans to get anything out of it. Canada's trade war just got real as the maker of Jeep and Chrysler announced they're abandoning a $13 billion investment in Ontario, the largest in Jeep's history. Will instead reopen shuttered plants in Illinois and Ohio, creating thousands of high-paying jobs in the heart of America's Rust Belt. Canada announced they'll sue to claw back billions in corporate welfare they already gave Jeep, but there is not much they can do about it. Now, this matters because cars is one of the biggest industry in Canada, accounting for 1/3 of manufacturing jobs. They are the lifeblood of Ontario, Canada's largest province, accounting for nearly half the Canadian economy. And projections say half of those car jobs could be at risk in the trade war. Now, Trump officially tariffed Canadian cars and parts at 25%, almost double the rate of Europe or Japan, who get 15%. But for now, most Canadian exports are exempt under NAFTA replacement USMCA to give Canada time to open up to American exports so we can all be friends again. Still, the tariffs are coming given Carney has not lifted a finger out of fear of Canada's powerful banking and dairy lobbies. Not a joke. Jeep apparently read the writing on the wall to the tune of $13 billion, with others to follow. Now, given U.S. exports make up almost 1 in 5 Canadian jobs, you would think Mark Carney would be working a deal. Instead, it's elbows up and pants down, with Carney floating goofy fantasies like green growth in a country with one of the biggest oil and gas reserves on Earth, but notably low on sunlight and ice-free windmills. Meanwhile, Carney fantasizes about replacing the U.S. market with a European Union that's even more trade restrictive, but presumably feels more like home to a prime minister who spent 8 of the past 10 years working in Europe, and of course also likes censorship and mass migration. Now, the background here is Canada's economy has been walking wounded for the past decade under Trudeau and Carney, and it is getting worse. Canada was actually richer than the U.S. in 2010. Now it's almost 40% poorer in 10 years. Mass migration is running 4 times U.S. levels, while government spending is exploding. The upshot is Canadian wages are now West Virginia level, but costs and home prices are San Francisco level. Just last month, Canada lost 41,000 jobs. That's nearly 400,000 in U.S. terms. Yet, Carney continues mass importing migrants, while unemployment just hit 7%. In the U.S., it is just over 4%. Canadian youth unemployment just hit a 15-year high of 14.7%. Wages are flat since 2016, and taxes take half of what little Canadians make. According to Stats Canada, 40% of middle-class Canadians now live hand-to-mouth, limping along on personal debt that's now 2.5 times U.S. levels. So it's next. In a perfect world, Canada opens the gates to American imports, so Trump opens America's gates. But Carney won the election as the anti-Trump, while the jobs at issue are blue-collars who don't vote liberal anyway. Meaning Carney's best political move is keep fighting Trump and lord over the ashes. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Regional bank stocks crashed last week. The trigger was the bankruptcy of First Brands, an apparent $6 billion Ponzi scheme that bought up boring car parts makers, borrowed heavily against them, and blew up with at least $2.5 billion vanished, calling into question First Brands' other $10 billion of loans. The blow-up sent investment bank Jefferies crashing 9% in a single day, And it follows another automaker that blew up last month with a $170 million hole. Meanwhile, separate disclosures from a pair of large regionals piled on. Zions Bancorp fell nearly 20% after announcing it discovered two big commercial loans with, quote, apparent misrepresentations. Western Alliance fell 11% in a single day after disclosing it is suing a major borrowing for fraud. Together, these three account for nearly $250 billion in assets. They took the entire regional banking industry down 6% in a single day, as investors wonder if anybody's actually looking at these loans, or do they just cut checks to anybody they sue? Or as J.P. Morgan's Jamie Dimon put it, quote, when you see one cockroach, there are probably more. Regional banks were already sitting on landmines in the crashing commercial real estate sector, with office vacancy rates hitting a record 20%. Pre-pandemic, it was 12%. According to Morgan Stanley, there's 18 years of supply sitting empty for Class A offices and 23 years for lower-grade Class B. Meanwhile, 7% of commercial real estate is in delinquency, despite banks gaming it with so-called extend and pretend, where the bank keeps lending new money to failed projects to make the loan appear healthy. Fraud if you do it, standard practice in banking. Now, this matters because commercial real estate makes up nearly 44% of regional bank assets, so if the industrial loans are also garbage, there is not much left. It's worth remembering regional banks nearly imploded just 2 years ago with a cascade of bank failures, starting with Silicon Valley Bank, that actually exceeded the 2008 crisis until the Fed and Treasury stepped in with a series of bailouts. These included $30 billion in write-offs taxed from your bank account, $200 billion in sweetheart loans against fictitious asset values, and Janet Yellen promising to cover $20 trillion of deposits with just $100 billion at the FDIC, 200-to-1 leverage, hedge funds eat your heart out. So as next, regional banks may be in dire straits and some could go bust, but it will not take down the economy for the simple reason that banks used the 2008 crisis to institutionalize bailouts, what I call pre-bailouts. That's how we got 2023. Banks no longer have to go through the humiliation of asking for bailouts. They get them without raising a finger, fictitious asset loans and all. Bailouts make banks risky, and regionals now have the cockroaches to prove it. So expect more bad loans and expect a whole lot more taxpayer bailouts. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.